Welcome back. I'm Emily.
I'm Greg.
And this is Telltale. And we had a comment on one of our YouTube posted videos of what we consider a classic, and our criteria for that. And we've talked about it, I think, between the two of us a little bit before, but this is entirely unscripted now. So we kind of have, I think we probably have a lot of aligned views on what we consider a classic. Like, as Telltale, we do have a sort of a criteria. A lot of it is stuff that's already been considered classics. A lot of it is older. We also we prefer to kind of deviate from the traditional classics by going for more obscure authors who have been around a while, or things that we think would be considered classics if they were better known, or if the publishers of the time had done a better job of marketing, or things like that. So we do kind of have that criteria, but we kind of like to leave it a little loose.
Yeah, we are conscious of the fact that what we, and I should say first, there is this division in people's minds. These are classics. These are today's books. And there's a difference. And today's books are not classics. Classics are moldy old things you read in English class. And we throw that out the window. We don't believe in that. Because every classic at one time was a brand new book, freshly published, put out there, hoping people would buy it. The author's hoping to make his living off of it. And it's not a classic yet. Nobody's discovered it yet. It's only when people pick it up and they read it and they fall in love with it. Now suddenly people start talking about it. Some people feel the need to analyze everything in it. And before you know it, this book is being taught in English classes to kids who are bored and don't want to be there, and would rather be out playing baseball. And it's now a classic. So there are definitely books being published today, being released right now to the market, that will someday be a classic. How do you know which books are going to get there? How do you know which books from the past deserve to be there? And we've run into that. We've picked up books that are older, and we've read them, and we go, "This is a classic." They just don't quite measure up to the definition. And then we have done some reviews of a little bit of newer stuff where we have agreed, yeah, this book is great. This is a classic. So what is it that makes it? What is it that makes that book different from every trashy novel out there? How does something become a classic? And where do you draw the line? Where do you say, okay, no, this doesn't quite measure up and can't be called a classic? So my feeling is it's a personal decision. It's based on how deeply you fall in love with that book. And so what is a classic in your mind might not be what's being taught in English classes. I think the English class professorial kind of thing saying, okay, James Joyce is great literature, and your science fiction stuff, Edward Elmer Smith and the Skylark of Space, that's not literature. That's not classic. That can't be great. Haven't read Skylark of Space yet, so I don't know if I consider it great, but it really isn't in everybody's mind. I mean, books like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are considered children's classics. Well, it's really quite an adult book.
Yeah, it's very dark.
Why is it just for kids? The Wizard of Oz, it was written for children, but a lot of adults love it and read it. And so, that kind of brings up the debate today with so much young adult literature being read, things like Harry Potter and the Hunger Games and all that. Are those going to be the Dr. Jekylls and Mr. Hydes of tomorrow? Are those going to be the
Harry Potter sure is.
well, probably closer to Wizard of Oz, but
well, it became an instant classic. Like the second it was on the market, it had a cult following.
Oh yeah,
like that.
But is that when you get to those newer works? How do you know that the popularity of that book isn't just people responding to marketing?
That's true.
And the hype.
That's very true.
Pushing it on them, and so everybody's reading it because everybody's reading it. And if you're not cool if you haven't read Harry Potter.
I am one of those people who often has to pose the question as a designer to myself. If you're making something for the average person, are you making something that's just average? I encountered that with the Hunger Games. I did not enjoy the Hunger Games. I did not feel like they were well written. I thought the story was a good start, but I was just not impressed with how it was executed. I was not impressed with the language used. It was almost too plain and too easy to read. And I'm like, kids these days are reading this, and this is going to be, a lot of people made a big deal out of it. And it was like, this is popularity doesn't always equal classic, but people were calling it like another instant classic sort of thing. And I'm like, I just don't agree. Or like 50 Shades of Grey.
But in the same vein, though, would you then say the John Carter of Mars novels or the Tarzan novels of Edgar Rice Burroughs, because those were, written for a popular audience, that those can't be classics?
I would say you have to really be careful with what you consider.
I don't think there's a person on the planet that would consider a Princess of Mars in the same category as James Joyce.
No,
and a Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. No, A Princess of Mars is not that high literature intelligent. It's just a stupid adventure written for teenage boys and naked women all throughout. You know, so
nudity.
So then, and that brings up the dilemma that it also applies to that perception of something like the Hunger Games, that just because it isn't highly literate, highly polished writing on the level of great authors like Joyce or Hemingway, that it can't be considered a classic, can't be put in the same category.
I disagree with that. I think good writing, as well as a good storyline, should kind of qualify it for classic literature. I think it should have a level of integrity in its ability not only to tell the story, but have a good synopsis for the story. I think that should be a qualifier for what is classic literature, because when you consider Harry Potter as an instant classic, not only is that a great story with great adventures, well-developed characters, and characters that grow with the audience it first was introduced to, you're also getting really well-written, really well-edited literature. This wasn't just like cutesy kids, simple Dr. Seuss, which Dr. Seuss is a whole other category of classic kids literature, but still a classic literature. You're not getting these small, short sentences. You're getting very well, complexly thought out storylines with really interesting points of view that's well communicated. It's not simplified, but it's not overdone either. So and the world building's phenomenal. So I do think that well-written literature should be a qualification for a classic piece. And then, but I also run into the issue of that can change sometimes with this, with whatever era it's written in.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I love Harry Potter. I think it's great story, well written. I love classic literature. I tend to like really dry English literature. I loved the classics. I grew up on the classics. But it's really hard for me when I encounter something like The Hunger Games, which is really simple language. Very non-complex. I had a little bit of that issue, not as much with Scott Westfield's Uglies series, which is science fiction. Really, it's a dystopian kind of dystopia versus utopia almost kind of situation. But that was also pretty well written. But again, I saw the decline in the writing. The language became simpler. The thoughts became less complex, the dialogue became less complex, and the characters started becoming less complex.
Yeah.
And I've seen that trend in literature a lot, and it makes me worried about what is or isn't being defined as a classic anymore. Because I feel like good literature is good literature, and it should be a classic if it's well done.
And definitely, if you just use popularity as your measuring stick, of course, a lot of the really highly literate books are not very popular, so they would go way down the scale of rating as a classic. And honestly, if you use popularity, probably 50 Shades of Grey would be the best, greatest novel ever, because it has sold huge numbers of copies, more than most other books. I believe it's the biggest selling as far as numbers right now. But does anybody call that classic? Does anybody call that a great book? Not that I've come across.
People like it. Because it's good smut.
Okay.
And sex sells. That's a big thing.
That's why Burroughs had topless women in all of his John Carter novels.
Absolutely.
But if you then say, well, just because something's popular, if it's not really highly written, if it's not comparable to James Joyce or who's another good example, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Shakespeare, Hemingway, if it's not on par with their quality of writing, then it can't be great. But then what about the Tarzan novels that have remained incredibly popular over the years and are still in print and still selling copies, and people are still making movies based on them? They're super popular. Are they really well written? Not by other standards, even of Burroughs' day. They are simpler writing, but they still have touched on some kind of thing within us that people have loved them over the years.
Yeah. I think universal themes tend to be another criteria for instant or classic literature. It's thought-provoking, it is easy to resonate with, it's reliable, it makes sense, it's cognitive. Like, you can not only read this piece and understand the storyline, but you could see yourself in that situation. You can put yourself in the character's shoes. You can put yourself in this environment and understand, like, hey, I'd probably do the same thing, or hey, I don't know that I'd thrive that well, you know, but I admire this person for being able to. And I definitely think those universal themes of, like, love is a good one. Universal themes of love, universal themes of war sometimes, like we saw in the Iliad. You have war as a theme. Everybody encounters war at some generation or another, unfortunately. It's just a part of living as humans who all believe different things. You have lots of inner conflicts about stuff. We've all experienced those, and, like, I think there's, like, only 26 very basic storylines that any story can have, which seems like really small amount, but when you think about all the different nuances you can add to characters and how you can mix and match those, you have infinite possibilities of stories. But yeah, I think the universal themes are another criteria that should be part of what considers classic literature.
Okay. But then as far as well written, that again, I think that's a trap. Because, okay, Burroughs, I don't feel, is all that well written. I think his writing is a little too simple, a little too clumsy when you compare it to other books of his day. But then H.G. Wells, who was contemporary, his writing style is very straightforward and easy to read. It's well written, but not well written like James Joyce, not well written like Henry James, who was Wells' style was not as high style as his friend Henry James or E.M. Forster that wrote back then. But that doesn't make Wells, Wells still had all these brilliant philosophical ideas in his books. It wasn't just science fiction, fantasy, concepting tanks before tanks were invented, concepting air warfare before air warfare happened. His mind wasn't as simple as that. He was analyzing his society and making some very deep perceptions about what was going on in his society, which elevates his work, even though it's real easy to read. His writing style is very straightforward and not high literature, but his works are still brilliant. And Isaac Asimov, who is the great explainer as far as I'm concerned, he can take the most difficult scientific concepts and write about it in a way that you just go, duh, of course it's like that, you understand it very well. Just because of the way Asimov writes, but his writing style is not highly literate. It is very straightforward and clear.
Yes. It's logical and relevant.
But,
which I think is still good writing.
Yeah.
Because I felt like J.K. Rowling did that in Harry Potter. I felt that way about China Mayville. He came up with very original ideas for the book Unlondon, which is one of his young adult novels. Very original ideas, but it still somehow all made sense. Like, it was very Alice in Wonderland, but very cognitive. Everything had an order. It made sense that this was the way it is. Like, the world still had a plot, and it still had a rhyme and reason to it. It just wasn't our usual rhyme and reason. I think that's still good writing, even if it's concise and simple language. But again, I think part of that is well-developed characters. You can still have a good story with well-developed characters with simple language. It's when you start getting into these flimsy cardboard characters that I start losing interest in the classic idea.
Yeah. But when it comes to science fiction especially, the earlier science fiction writers like Asimov, Clarke, they were more interested in ideas than characters.
Yep.
The characters in their stories were just vehicles to get you to the scientific concept that they were trying to get across in their story. So the characters aren't that well written. So if you're gonna criticize based on characterization, having to have strong character, pretty much everything written before 1990 needs to be thrown in the trash. But then you're losing City, you're losing Childhood's End, you're losing the Foundation trilogy, you're losing Fahrenheit 451, you're losing all these really great books that, no, they don't have the best characterization, no, their writing isn't the highest literature, but these people forged a whole new type of writing that isn't about character, that isn't about the same things as you would get from a John Steinbeck novel. It's about something totally new that is unique to late 1800s, 1900s, and our 21st century. Never before have we seen our lives impacted by our scientific ideas like we have in the last 150 years. It has really, really changed us, and we're constantly affected by the scientific things going on around us, like right now with the pandemic. This is a science fiction novel plot.
Yep.
So many of the science fiction people online are on Facebook posting, okay, what's the next science fiction disaster that's going to happen this year?
2020 bingo. It's 2020 bingo on social media.
So science fiction is really about that, not about individual people. It's about the bigger picture that of human society, our world, our universe even, that makes the individual person insignificant.
And I think that's interesting that you bring that up too, because you are correct. Like, there are a lot of really flimsy character pieces of classic literature, but they're still really great. But I think it's because those characters hold that ideal or that philosophy or that scientific experiment as a value. They're less flimsy that way. Whereas, like, I felt like when you encounter, say, like, I'm going to keep going back to the Hunger Games because that's a contemporary one I think a lot of people have read. When you go back to it, the whole thing is just survival. It's a universal theme, but your characters aren't that complex in the first book, at least in the first book. I couldn't even get through the other two. I'd eventually want to. But they're flimsy for the ideal of survival.
Okay.
Like, that just seems really... That seems too cardboard to me. That's too instinctual of a human thing. Like, there's no other parts to it, really. Like, yeah, there's a little bit of a romance in there, and yeah, there's a little bit of a, you know, it's like this fake it till you make it sort of thing, but it's so superficial on the surface that even, like, those who are trying to survive are superficial on the surface, where there really isn't an ideal other than we hate this government and we hate doing these Hunger Games.
Yeah.
There's nothing more complex than that. Like, anybody could say that. I hate being hungry and I hate my government. Like, anybody in America could say that right now.
Pretty much.
Like, it just seems almost too... It feels like a cop-out. And it's like, how do we have classic literature that don't have these, you know, even short stories? You don't have a lot of time to develop these characters.
Right.
So how do we have classic literature while balancing all these other things that are kind of a criteria for classic literature, as, you know, we've seen repeated in classics? Yeah. One thing I've also noticed is a lot of classic literature ends up on the banned book list first.
Yeah, they have dangerous ideas. But there again, it's the idea that gets it there. So I think right now, you know, since Harry Potter created kind of this renaissance in book publishing, we are at a great place where there are all these amazing writers like China Miéville that you mentioned, Neil Gaiman, all these amazing writers who are capable of doing the good writing. Now they can do the kinds of stories that other writers were attempting to make great stories out of. They could take it and run with it, and we could see a huge number of classics coming. And I think very possibly we have, you know, judging by how much the readers have loved certain authors recently, and the number of authors, especially in the science fiction, fantasy, and horror genre that have come out and are writing some amazing stuff, there is a possibility of just a huge number of classics coming out of this. But it's hard to tell today.
Hindsight's 20/20.
Yeah.
Really.
The test of time is the ultimate judge of whether a book is a classic or not. You know, books like Robinson Crusoe, Don Quixote, The Scarlet Letter, these
Anything
are classics.
by Mark Twain,
David
basically.
Copperfield, yeah. These are classics, and you know, you might not like the books, but I don't think you're going to say, no, it's not classic English literature. These are classics. Because they've stood the test of time, and enough other people have loved them that it doesn't matter what you think. They're classics. They're there.
Or the themes are important. Like, I hate to say it, but Mein Kampf is a classic piece of literature. It's not great.
And Karl Marx's, was it Das Kapital or something like that?
Like, these are really controversial books, but they're important because they let us understand the psyche of a person who is broken, or a person who has committed atrocities. They're important for the fact that they exist to inform us of what can go wrong and has gone wrong. But, like, I think that's another thing, too. A lot of people have a hard time with classics just because of the lives of the authors. And we're seeing that with J.K. Rowling right now, where she's part of controversies against trans rights and things like that. But the fact of the matter is, she wrote a damn good book with some really damn good universal, you know, universal themes that people can relate to. And I can separate the work from the artist. But that means they're no less
Poe and
classics.
Lovecraft were like that, too. Edgar Allan Poe, he lived in the South before the Civil War. Okay, so he was totally racist, and some of his stories display that.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean The Black Cat isn't an amazing short story, or The
Is
Fall of
it-
the House of Usher, which I just reread.
Was Wells, he was a socialist. A lot of people
He
have
was
a
a
hard time.
socialist.
He
People
was a
have a hard time with that
self-proclaimed
today.
hardcore socialist, and a lot of people, we've even had some comments on some of our social media stuff. A lot of people have a hard time with that, or don't want to believe it, because he is such a great writer, and they have such a hard time with the concept of socialism. As the United States being a very individualist country, we understand that fear. A lot of people have a hard time with it.
But Wells' socialism was not communism.
No, it wasn't
so many
the same
people
thing.
today, socialism is thrown basically anything anybody doesn't like that they think is oppressive. Oh, that's socialist. No.
No, it's just a different...
Socialist is looking out for each other, you
Yeah.
know, and being a community instead of going
a
off
large
by
scale-
yourself and shooting at everybody that comes near you.
Yeah, it's a large scale and radical version of the social contract where the tribe comes together and just takes care of everybody else, and we just assume that the good deeds wash out, work out in the wash. There's no, there's like community pots of money, everybody just takes care of everybody else. Everybody tries to pull as much of the, as much as everybody else. He had more of a concept of what would be the ideal society, and people really dedicated to it.
And it came from the fact that Wells came from a working class background. And in Victorian England, the working class was basically indentured slavery. They were under the worst conditions,
Not
getting
fair
the
trade.
terrible pay, and had an extremely difficult time getting out of their circumstances. And Wells wanted to see that end. He saw that there were good people, intelligent people who had something to contribute, who deserved better than to live in squalor.
Yeah, people living up to their full potential and being encouraged by their community to live up to their full potential. But again, people had a hard time with his writing, or don't like that he's a socialist, and they don't read his literature because of it, which is a whole other topic for another day. But
it's only because socialism has been equated with communism so much, and even communism is equated with Joseph Stalin and his ridiculous ideas. Wells met with Stalin and tried to convince him of the right way to go, and left very bitter at that meeting, because Stalin, he was a dictator.
he was a narcissist too.
Yeah,
Severely
and Wells
narcissistic.
did not stand for that.
Nope.
He did not want to see people living in a dictatorship, which is ultimately, communism and socialism are just labels that have been stuck on the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a dictatorship and nothing more, really. It did not live up to any of the ideals of the political theories
Absolutely.
that they threw around in conversation.
Yeah, but back to the whole idea of like classic literature. A lot of people, it kind of goes back. Like a lot of classic literature was on the banned book list for this reason, though.
Yeah.
Authors are humans too. Like they have messy lives. They, just because they're creative doesn't mean they're perfect. Like I think we have this concept that these writers are like this exception because they had this influence in society, and really at the time, they really didn't have a ton of influence. They were just nobodies who wrote great stories, and then they became classics because of all the themes we talked about, and then some, like the universal themes, the relevance to what they were, how they resonated with their audience, how they were marketed, all those things. So, yeah. Where were we going with this? I lost my train of thought.
That's an element of classics, that they are usually dangerous.
They're controversial.
In some way.
Yeah, they're very controversial.
And that's only because the authors have brains and are thinking. But for me, ultimately, what produces a classic, it's a personal decision that you read a book and you fall in love with it and it changes your life somehow. That's the classic. Even if nobody else likes it.
Yeah. I would have to agree with that. It does have to come to personal choice, and I do think there is also a social choice, like a societal choice as well. Like I think there is to some degree a popularity issue.
Yeah.
To what degree, I can't say, because some of them didn't become popular till long after someone was dead. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Or there was this revival of something, and so-and-so's book suddenly was the book to go to for, this concept or whatever. People started talking about it, people gained interest, and suddenly it was it was brand new again.
Yeah.
And it became a classic.
Yeah, and we've seen a couple of those since we started Telltale almost a year ago. Like Herland, which nobody even knew about that book for many, many years after it was published, and only became a classic when the feminist movement in modern times rediscovered this story and embraced it for its feminist ideas. And something like At the Sign of the Jack-o'-lantern, which, okay, this isn't James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, great English class literature, but it was just such a cool book, such an enjoyable book, that it made an impression on both of us. And we call that one a classic. It is an old book. It is a very good story. I think it's well written, but it's an easy read, and it's a popular read. It's not.
This is the kind of book a lot of people could relate to. And it does have those universal themes of trying to deal with difficult family. There's a complexity with humor and a balance as well, and that was very well written, very well done. Plus, it was just a gorgeous book.
Yeah.
She knew how to market that.
And then you have your stories that the moment they're published, everybody just knows that this is something.
It's a big deal.
Better than normal. The Great Gatsby became at that. The Lord of the Rings is on that level. Of course, Hemingway, a lot of his works. John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath.
John Updike did a lot of them. He's won a lot of awards for his literature. He's a more contemporary writer.
And in the science fiction field, this still is, the jury's still a little bit out on Gideon the Ninth, but everybody seems to be loving it, and I think it is a well-written book, and, well, we'll have to read the whole trilogy, I think, but I think this one has the potential of being a great science fiction classic.
Game of Thrones is another good one.
Yeah,
those are becoming one. And it's interesting, too, because now we're seeing this. We're seeing a lot of things that are becoming instant classics, also becoming instant television shows and movies.
Well, that's how they're becoming so big, is that somebody makes it. Most of these aren't. George Martin was not that well known outside of science fiction fandom until Game of Thrones appeared on HBO. And then all of a sudden, he's filthy rich and known world over.
I actually experienced that with Brian Jakes. Brian Jakes writes the Redwall series. I had actually experienced the Redwall series through the animated series that was on Wisconsin Public Television when I was younger. I grew up watching that, and then I started reading the books. And they were identical to the show, which is how every freaking show should be if you make it based off a book. But anyway, I digress. Another great writer who should be an instant classic because he just builds these worlds and these characters so well. Never mind that they're, sentient, autonomous animals, but with human thoughts and feelings. But it was, it's just really interesting to see how this happened. Like, how did it become that now we write great pieces of literature and then suddenly they're popularized by a TV or movie. We saw the same thing with Harry Potter. Like, it was an instant classic when it was written, but even more so when it became a film. And I just came back from Universal, so I'm really stuck on Harry Potter. Just letting y'all know.
But I do think it does come down to a personal thing. It reminds
really
me of the end of Fahrenheit 451, where those people memorize their favorite book and they become the book. In a lot of ways, when you read a book that touches you that way, it does become a part of you.
Yeah.
You don't literally become the book, but that book becomes a part of who you are and really moves your life. And so even if nobody else considers it a classic, if it did that for you, it is a classic for you. And you should never let anybody tell you it's not, even if it's a trashy romance novel. If it really changed your life and really moved you, then don't let people tell you that it's garbage.
But they will tell you it's garbage.
Well, yeah, because
because everybody
we still have
has
that thing
preferences.
that if it isn't touted, if it didn't win the Nobel Prize for Literature or the Pulitzer Prize, and it isn't paraded by all the
it's not on
professors at
Oprah's book
universities,
list.
yeah,
Another big.
She's
got
if
some
it's
great
not
books on her book list.
put on a pedestal by the universities as great literature, that it's not a classic, and that's just totally wrong. Books are all about us enjoying them, and when they really touch our lives, we've enjoyed it immensely, and that's what makes a classic.
Yep.
Whether it touched your life or whether you enjoyed it immensely.
I'd take
it's
it even a
ultimately
step
joy.
further and say if it challenged you or made any impression on you in any manner, because some of my favorite books are ones that called me out on things like Where the Crawdad Sings. It's a hard book to read. Very hard book to read. Very tragic story. But it called me out on a lot of my, we have white privilege. We have, how sometimes when you're middle class and you see poverty, you don't know what poverty is. And you have all these you are more privileged than you realize. And I enjoyed those books that called me out on those things as well. It wasn't just, not because it was great and made me feel happy, but because it made me think about the way I see the world and changed my worldview to a degree.
Right, but it should still be something that when you sit down and start reading it, maybe you have to struggle through the first chapter, but then you get engrossed in this
compelled.
thing, you can't put it down. As opposed to the book where you're just continuing to struggle and you just hate it.
Yeah.
You can't consider that a classic. That doesn't mean other people don't consider it a classic. It's a very personal. What books are the best is a very personal decision. You can't use popularity or English classes or professors or theses or how many copies have been sold or
Critics.
Yeah, you can't allow any of that stuff. Publisher hype. You can't allow any of that stuff to convince you that it's a classic. It has to be you. Sit down, read it. Do you get drawn into it? Are you engrossed in it? At the end,
And
you
are
feel
you willing
it's
to
worthwhile.
share it? I think that's why we started Telltale altogether. Is we have a love for a lot of books. We love reading, and we want to share it because we believe they're classics. And I think that's worth the whole thing is you got to be willing to share it.
Yeah.
That's how you build a classic. That's how you share, a love for things. That's how you build these communities about who love literature and who love classic literature, who really believe in this book or in this author's work. You just dive in.
But
and start cults.
A classic could have been published a year ago
It's
and
true.
still be a classic. Even if nobody is calling it a classic yet, it could still be a classic.
My journals could be a classic and they're not even published yet. You never know though. It is that simple sometimes. Diary of Anne Frank. It's just a girl's journal, and now it's a piece of high literature. Hard piece of high literature, but a piece of high literature. So.
And I just got to make this statement that no, we didn't call each other.
No.
We just must have been in a mood or something.
Yeah.
To both wear black.
Yeah, it's Halloween.
I guess it goes with some, because we did Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in the Island of Dr. Moreau tonight also.
I got this one at Universal Studios last week.
Oh, cool.
From Beetlejuice.
What does it say?
I myself am strange and unusual.
Okay.
It's got that Halloween theme.
Yeah.
But yeah. So.
Okay, so any more thoughts about what makes a classic?
No. Honestly, I think we covered just about everything because there are so many nuances to it. We could probably do a series of videos on this. Keep coming back to it. But yeah, that's a roundabout way of answering that particular viewer's question. We like to keep it pretty loose, to be honest, because there are so many different nuances. And honestly, what we consider classics is just what we've debated between the two of us.
Yeah.
There's no very hardline criteria for what we consider it, but we do we are thoughtful and analytical about what we choose to consider a classic or not. And some of them have been deemed classics already by society, and we just want to revive the love for those things because I think they're underappreciated.
Yeah, and we do now have a website, telltalebooks.com, and on that website, about all that's there so far is our list of what we consider to be classics, but if you go there and look at it, understand it's just what we've reviewed so far, what we've talked about so far, and there's tons and tons and tons of books that we want to get to yet that aren't on that list yet because frankly we haven't either haven't read them or haven't talked about them enough to determine that they should be on that list. So you can send us, post comments in our Facebook page or on YouTube page about anything you think is missing from our list. And, like the same guy that suggested this subject also wants us to read and review Jurassic Park. So maybe look for that one coming up in the future. We'll listen to you.
I've never read it.
I haven't read that either.
Yeah,
Just saw the
I'm
movie.
interested. Yeah.
Love the movie.
Great
Never
series.
read the book. So that might be a good one for a future
I also
review.
went there when I was at Universal.
Oh.
Universal just picked up all these classics and just mine. That's what they did. Even the classic movie monsters. Damn it. Damn you, Universal. I love you. Anyway.
Yeah, except they gotta start making some good horror films again.
Yeah, seriously. Come on, guys.
They tried rebooting their whole classic Universal Monsters list, and they have not gone over well. Especially like The Invisible Man. Nobody has made a really good Invisible Man movie since the Claude Rains version.
The only one he shows up in that I love him in is League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
Oh, okay.
I really like that version of the Invisible Man.
No, Claude Rains is just the right amount of creepy for that character in the original movie.
Yeah. I'll have to watch that. I'm sure my husband has it. But yeah, so.
Okay. So that's all we got, I think.
Yeah. Good luck
Hope
wrapping
that
your
helps
head
some
around.
of you.
Yeah. Good luck wrapping your head around that.
Basically, we said, well, there's all kinds of criteria, but you're on your own.
Yeah. Do what you want, because a pirate is free.
Yeah.
Anyway. So yeah, like, subscribe, make suggestions. We always are looking for new instant classics, reviewing all kinds of stuff. So let us know what your thoughts, and we will see you next time.